Hello, and welcome to our presentation for the Nonprofit Organization Project. I am Michaela Kashuda, and I will be presenting with my team member, Zandria Lynn Bates. Both of us have had prior experience in conducting academic research, which is what helped us to decide to pursue option 4, to choose our own academically oriented research project for this class. Let's begin. The COVID-19 pandemic has impacted many stakeholders in the international community, and that includes nonprofit organizations. Despite the plethora of information regarding small businesses and restaurants in regard to shutdowns and restrictions, there's been a lack of focus concerning the impact of COVID-19 restrictions on nonprofit organizations. We propose that the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted managers, staff, and volunteers within nonprofit organizations in regard to challenges faced, actions taken, and relative success across a range of positions within nonprofit organizations. We conducted a survey regarding the impact of COVID-19 on individuals affiliated with nonprofit organizations in Lethbridge, and we found financial, collaborative, interpersonal, and operational factors that impacted the experience of individuals. Since COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic in March 2020, governments and public health authorities have had to implement various restrictions to mitigate the effects of the virus within communities. Altogether, we seek to gain a deeper understanding of how individuals of local Lethbridge nonprofits have been and will continue to be impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. From current literature and interviews conducted up until this point, we expected several key themes to emerge, which include financial commitment, job commitment, mental health concerns, professional opportunity, and physical health. Additionally, we found there to be key themes regarding the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on nonprofit organizations, which were identified through an extensive literature review. These include financial, collaborative, interpersonal, and operational impacts. So the key findings from the literature about financial impact include the fact that nonprofit organizations have suffered more immediate and heavy fiscal shocks in the early stages of the pandemic compared to for-profits. Additionally, nonprofits with financial reserves did hold a better financial stability throughout the crisis. And additional support for the financial factors is that a Lethbridge News report shared that many organizations noted that financial resources were the most integral part of the operations and that most revenues decreased over the course of the pandemic. So collaborative responses to COVID-19 related challenges are particularly valuable for nonprofit organizations. Here, cause-related marketing refers to the actions in which small enterprises and nonprofits strengthen local communities and help health infrastructure through combined efforts to stop the COVID-19 pandemic. It was also stated in the literature that the COVID-19 pandemic provided windows of collaborative opportunity for nonprofit organizations to explore these new partnerships. The next significant theme is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on nonprofit organizations is interpersonal impacts. So a key issue that's been identified in the nonprofit sector is that workers may be at higher risk of losing their job commitment compared to for-profit workers as a direct result of COVID-19. This can be attributed to the fact that nonprofit workers have less opportunity for professional advancement, competitive wages, and experience a higher intensity of crisis events. A recent report by Imagine Canada offers that nonprofits are making permanent adaptations and are more likely to continue to work and offer services virtually post-pandemic. Throughout the literature, there are recurring themes in regard to operational impacts, which are flexibility and adaptability, as successful nonprofit organizations have quickly transitioned to alternative delivery methods, such as online. Additionally, this quote below illustrates the importance of adapting to the COVID-19 pandemic. So our guiding research question for our project was, how have individuals affiliated with Lethbridge nonprofit organizations adapted to challenges due to the COVID-19 pandemic? And from here, we aim to identify the challenges and successes across a range of positions within nonprofit organizations.
So that brings us to our methods. What did we actually do? So we designed and released a survey in which individuals would self-report their experiences regarding to the COVID-19 pandemic in regards to their nonprofit affiliation. And so our sampling method used was a convenience and snowball sampling method. We sent out emails to approximately 40 nonprofits in the Lethbridge area and asked them to share the email with their colleagues and volunteers in order to ensure that they also had access to complete the survey. This was designed to consider a range of different perspectives, as I mentioned. And so areas considered were volunteer roles, staff roles, managerial roles, board of director roles, and then we did leave another option for other in case there was one that didn't quite fit in that. And this included a range of aspects, as you can see, including financial, business adaptations, challenges, successes, interpersonal, and more. There was a very wide range of things considered here, as it's quite an exploratory study. And so the actual methods in terms of analysis, we did both quantitative and qualitative. So quantitative, we did, as you can see, descriptive, univariate, and bivariate through SPSS. And then that qualitative text analysis looked at the open responses that were left by each of the individuals in terms of what were repeated themes and ideas, and what can we really generate insights from there. So that brings us to our results. First off, we have our descriptive results. And this is just a wide overview of what we got with the most important things noted. There was quite a lot of detail in each of the results. So we only highlight a few things in this presentation. First off, volunteer retention was negatively impacted. Furthermore, employee and volunteer mental health and in-person activities were both negatively affected as well. For the first two bullet points here, it is important to note that that mean is from a scale of 1 to 5, in which 5 is very negatively impacted and 1 is very positively impacted. So then moving on to that second bullet point there, that online presence was slightly positively affected. Individuals saw that although they were forced to use more technology, that technology was beneficial to them in a slightly positively way. And then moving into what was most challenging for these organizations and the individuals, shifting to work from home, strategic barriers, and additional expenses from COVID-19 protocols were the most challenging overall. And moving into those 4 key areas that we had mentioned before, we continue to find results that correlate with these areas, that financial, collaborative, interpersonal, and operational. In terms of financial, the only financial variable we looked at that had any significant correlation was job insecurity. And there was that strong significant correlation between job insecurity and volunteer retention impact. Whereas you can see in that graphic there, as volunteer retention impact was more negatively impacted, job insecurity was found to be more challenging. And then the results from our qualitative analysis showed that financial difficulties of layoffs, staff shortages, organizational restructuring, and decreased funding were quite prevalent here. Overall, there was a very negative impact on financial aspects. Moving to collaborative now, there was quite a large range of correlations in terms of collaborative and interpersonal areas. So again, I'm only touching on a few, but there were quite a few in these areas. First off, we have recruitment difficulties and strategic barriers were found to have a significant correlation. You can see that is what's included in the graphic here, which although it's not quite as strong of a correlation as the previous correlation we mentioned, as that recruitment difficulty is found to be more challenging, strategic barriers are also found to be more challenging. And then there was a significant correlation between recruitment difficulties and employee and/or volunteer mental health problems. And then from our qualitative aspect here, that was a heavy transition to online format was met with decreased engagement. That was both in terms of the colleagues and your work transition to online, as well as for clients accessing services and events that were forced to be moved online. There was quite a few challenges here, although as we'll see in a moment, there were some benefits as well. So moving into that interpersonal aspect, personal mental health problems and volunteer and employee mental health problems were really highlighted in the significant correlations in this area. And that personal mental health problems is important to note that since we had only employees, managers, and board members answer our surveys, we actually don't have any volunteer responses here. And so that is going to impact most likely what is a significant correlation. So that personal mental health problem had a significant correlation with both strategic barriers and a lack of community between employees and volunteers. And then furthermore, and quite similarly, employee and or volunteer mental health problems were correlated with a lack of community between the employees and volunteers, which is kind of what we'd expect to see here, right? And so as you can see in the graphic there, employee and or volunteer mental health problems, as that was more challenging, that lack of community between employees and volunteers was also more challenging. There's that positive relationship there. And so that interpersonal communications within nonprofit organizations actually improved during the COVID-19 pandemic. As I had mentioned, there was that switch to online in which that online presence was positively impacted. That allowed for greater interpersonal communication. And that was both with the individuals you would work with. So if you were working for the nonprofit, your colleagues and volunteers, as well as with clients as well. So moving into the last area, the operational impact findings, a lot of these overlapped with other areas, but one that was significant here specifically is the volunteer retention impact and client retention impact had a strong significant correlation. As volunteer retention impact was more negatively impacted, so was that client retention. And then that substantial challenge of the continuous uncertainty, which was widely noted to be directly from changing COVID restrictions and regulations, has resulted in greater adaptability and greater creativity for the individuals of these organizations. So practical and theoretical implications, what do we have here? Well, these findings can be used to support nonprofits in regards to crisis management, not only the crisis event of the COVID-19 pandemic, but wider to other areas that are crisis events as well. The insights allow nonprofit organizations to understand how their experiences compare to other nonprofits in Lethbridge. They can see not only if their challenges that they faced were faced by other nonprofits, but can see where other areas have been excelling and then therefore adapt and get that creative and competitive advantage. And then in terms of the theoretical implications, the findings confirm and extend previous research, specifically Quincy et al., which found that individuals in nonprofit sector were more heavily experienced the intensity of crisis events. And we can see this in our studies in that employee and volunteer mental health aspect was more negatively affected overall, as well as it was repeatedly coming up in correlations that were significant. So the limitations of our work. First off, our sampling method did allow multiple responses per organization. And so it's hard to guarantee that the individuals weren't repeatedly answering or heavily biasing their organization. However, since we had a small sample size, which is our next limitation, that was less significant, we expect. But that small sample size was our greatest limitation. Although we contacted over 40 nonprofit organizations, we only got 15 responses, which leads us to believe that the survey was not shared with individuals across the organizations. Specifically also, we didn't receive any volunteer responses. And so not only does that impact what our findings are, but also shows that the sampling method was not completely effective. Moving into future research. Because this is such an exploratory and wide-ranging study, there's numerous areas of future research that can be considered. But one of the areas here is an extensive and integrative analysis of how demographic factors shape the individual experience during COVID-19. This is an area that we expect would provide greater detail and one that we would have considered if we had that greater sample size. And then moving also, we want to encourage the use of a human resource perspective in examining how operations have changed. Because of the level of detail and the number of correlations that we found in that collaborative and interpersonal aspect, we believe the human resource perspective would be quite valuable in future research. So in conclusion, our study builds on previous research and identifies those main themes that emerged regarding the experiences of the individuals during the COVID-19 pandemic associated with Lethbridge nonprofits. Those areas, as a recap, are financial, collaborative, interpersonal, and operational impacts, which were wide-ranging and went very in-depth in this exploratory study. So thank you so much for watching and listening to us about our research. We would like to extend our gratitude to the class, Dr. Deborah Basil for her support, as well as all the nonprofits and individuals that engaged in our research.